The Archaeology of Death and Memory with Professor Howard Williams. It's Archaeodeath.
Archaeodeathlings, this is my YouTube version of a conference presentations I delivered at the 45th annual meeting of the Theoretical Archaeology Group at the University of Bournemouth on the 15th of December on the topic of Cosy Cremation. Now, my research over the last 25 years has focused on the cremation practices of early Anglo-Saxon England, the 5th to 7th centuries CE, and early Anglo-Saxon England is a term that refers to those centuries in southeast Britain where we find a mixture of furnished burial practices by cremation, inhumation, and cemeteries where both practices have an emphasis or are practiced contemporaneously together. And this stems from my 2000 doctoral thesis, The Burnt Germans of the Age of Iron, where I explored in an analysis of existing osteological and archaeological data the variability and key themes in the treatment of the dead by burning. This very much drew on the influential and important work of Catherine Hills and her colleagues working at the Spong Hill Cemetery, from which these three photographs are taken, and the work of leading osteoarchaeologist Jackie McKinley of Wessex Archaeology, who conducted the osteological analysis of the human remains from the cremation burials at Spong Hill, the largest cremation cemetery ever discovered and fully excavated. My research also put that into broader national patterns, which you can see in this map, where I'm pointing out there are 6 areas of cremation. There's an area where there are large cremation cemeteries in the East Midlands and East Anglia. There's a territory where there are none of those large cremation cemeteries but mixed rite cemeteries, alongside sites where inhumation dominates but cremation is also found. In addition to that, there are 3 zones in the 5th and 6th centuries where cremation is rare, and these are East Kent, although there are some cremation burials now known and excavated from a few cemeteries in East Kent, Wiltshire, and Cleveland and Northumberland, and East Yorkshire beyond 1 or 2 sites, including the site of Sancton. The 6th geographical area to reference is Western and Northern Britain beyond this zone, and that's worth flagging up because there were no cremations known from this period from those territories, although now we can add, thanks to this new edited collection I've put together with Femke Lippock, examples from Northern Britain. So we now have a picture that cremation practices were a discrete new phenomenon separate from early to mid-Roman cremation practices that was taking place in territories that we showed sustained contact across the North Sea and evidence of Germanic speaking peoples migrating, as well as the continuation of an indigenous population, the native population of Roman Britain. So this was an area of intermingling between natives and incomers, and they are adopting cremation in different proportions and using different technologies across these regions. And the ongoing work, as published in this collection, including reflections by James Harland, Kirsty Squires and Gareth Perry, has added rich new details to that picture that I presented in my doctoral research. This book also puts cremation in a broader Northwest European context and shows that cremation is found in Ireland, Northern Britain, as well as large parts of the near continent and Scandinavia. So cremation isn't has a single religious, ethnic or cultural label to it. It is a variable practice utilised in different ways, in different intensities, in different materialities and corporealities in different parts of Northwest Europe in the early Middle Ages. But in the context of the conference session I was presenting in, looking at the concept of cosiness, I was keen to return to cremation practices, something I've published extensively on, to reflect on how we understand these rather humble traces of complex, multi-stage, elaborate funerals, and think about issues of intimacy, of warmth, of the multisensorial proximity and intimacy of the living and the dead in the post-cremation stages of collecting the cremains, transporting them, storing them within urns and bags, and then finally burying them in a cemetery in close proximity, and the relationships between the dead themselves as these cemeteries accumulate over time. And I started off by making the point that cremation is often understood as all about display and elaborate corporeal transformation, and this is an idea I've partly promoted in my own work, in a paper, for example, from 2004 in the Journal of Material Culture called Death Warmed Up. I tried to emphasize that the agency of cremation was about witnessing and experiencing this multi-stage transformation by fire and incorporating the dead into a new kind of body. But that kind of approach only takes us so far, and it is it's not helped. Our understanding of early Anglo-Saxon period cremation is not helped by the fact that we often display them as rather unpresupposing ceramic urns in museum cases, as here witnessed in 2010 at the Norwich Castle Museum, without any sense of the original burial or cemetery context represented, and without any sense of the process and the sequence and the variability in the treatment of the dead, in which animals are being sacrificed, grave goods are being placed with the dead in the urns, but also earlier pyre goods had accompanied the dead onto their funeral fires. The British Museum's very modest display is one of the few places using examples from Eastern England where the cremation process is discussed, and this seems to take inspiration from, at least in part, from not only the work of Catherine Hills, Jackie McKinley and others, but also some of my work focusing on the significance of combs and toilet implements, where it says an Anglo-Saxon cremation, the early Anglo-Saxons practiced cremation in which the dead person was placed on a pyre and burnt along with specially chosen grave goods, pyre goods I think they would be called. The remains were then gathered into an urn like this one and buried in the ground. Personal grooming equipment like the bone comb, tweezers and razor were often found in these burials, perhaps symbolising the rebuilding of the body after its cremation. And that's great, but again, it's only a single urn and it's seen as a normative practice. And I'm pleased that that interpretation, which originally was suggested by T.C. Lethbridge, but has been developed by J.D. Richards and myself, to think about the significance of grooming implements in terms of body rebuilding after the funeral conflagration. I think is an important one, but the burial spaces are absent. There's no way these museum displays conjure any sense of technology or place. And at the redisplayed Sutton Hoo Visitor Centre and site in Suffolk, there are likewise no attempts to bring fire into the equation, even though the majority of the princely mounds at Sutton Hoo cover cremation burials. Here you can now see cremated remains rather starkly put on display on a transparent disc, so you can witness cremation as a practice. And the hanging bowl from the Tranmere House site, which was one of the containers used for cremating the dead in the late 6th century, prior to the establishment of the princely burial mounds. But on the site there is no representation of fire, there's no discussion of cremation alongside inhumation in either the Tranmere site or the Tranmere House site or on the main princely burial ground. There's only one panel I could find saying, imagine an Anglo-Saxon landscape. Look at the landscape around you. Above you to the left is the royal burial ground. that's their framing of it as the royal burial ground. That's why they capitalise it as if it had a status in the early Middle Ages. Of course, we don't know that. The majestic burial mounds were once visible from a great distance along the river. They were a signpost to the front door of the East Anglian kingdom. And that is actually an argument I would endorse, and I think I'm one of the people that's promoted that in my 2001 article on the landscape context of Sutton Hoo. Imagine standing here in Anglo-Saxon times, around 1400 years ago. A cremation is taking place at the Royal Cemetery, and the fire is burning with great intensity. The tall column of smoke can be seen for miles. In front of you, crowds of people follow the path to the cemetery to pay their respects. And that is really evocative, and I love that. But again, there's no visualisation. There's no sense of how did that one cremation relate to other cremations that are taking place. Why is cremation taking place? How did it look? How did it feel? And where exactly were the pyres placed as opposed to the burial of the cremated remains? All of those are left to the imagination. And while I've done collaborative work many years ago with Dr. Aaron Watson, the images that were then published in my 2006 book, Death and Memory in Early Medieval Britain, and subsequently in an article in 2007 from Anglo-Saxon Studies in Archaeology and History 14, which I co-edited with Sarah Semple, these three images do allow us to get somewhere into visualising the preparation of the dead in a settlement context, the nighttime conflagration and the crowds in attendance, and then the importance of post-cremation selection of artefacts and ashes and cremains for then subsequent disposal. And in all those regards, this takes us some way towards understanding the process, but there's less here to tell you about the variability, and there's nothing about the actual burial rituals themselves in this kind of imagery. So what I'm trying to say is that in our museums and our few artistic attempts to render cremation, cremation is seen as an act of burning, but there's no sense of the variability or the process. And Victor Ambros's famous picture, commissioned by Martin Carver for his popular book on Sutton Hoo and then reproduced elsewhere, is really good. It brings up that sense of intimacy of a small family group in the act of burying the cremated dead, and that is, I think, positive. But where is that wider coziness in life and death? How does this act relate to other burial acts, and how does that connect to the significance of the cremated dead and the way they're considered and treated? And most of our fantasy and historical fiction representations of cremation are towards the theatrical and the spectacular, the dramaturgical. And these are all snapshots from the popular TV series Vikings 2013 to 2021. So not early Anglo-Saxon at all, but they serve to show how in popular culture there is a growing understanding of open-air cremation as an early medieval practice in Northern Europe. And the Vikings, a catch-all term for many different disparate groups, are shown practicing burning the dead both on land and on water, during raids and during the routines of daily life. Some of them are spectacular performances, some of them honour the elite, but others honour and commemorate those who die of a plague, those that die in battle. So cremation is, alongside other inhumation practices, seen as part of a spectacular range of variable disposal methods afforded to the early medieval dead. And that's positive, but the emphasis is towards that theatrical and elaborate. And in that regard, therefore, when we actually want to try and think about the 5th, 6th century cremation practices of large Eastern English cemeteries such as Spong Hill, and particularly Spong Hill, I don't feel we've been given the pop culture apparatus to facilitate a focus on the cosy, the intimate, the fine-grained connections of the dead with each other and the living with the dead. And I think this is also played out in the academic literature that has preceded my principal studies following on from my doctoral thesis in the noughties. Notably, the Chronology and Synthesis, Volume 9 for Spong Hill, authored by Catherine Hills and Sam Lucy, has much to commend it about re-evaluating the site and its chronology, and it puts, frames and brackets the many individual catalogue volumes and the preliminary discussions that Hills and others have published elsewhere. There's much to commend it, but in terms of understanding that spatial, material, technological cosiness of cremation, the bringing the dead in close proximity to the living and then to each other in burial, is not really discussed. And this is part of a broader problem with the lack of mortuary archaeological theory in this volume, and themes relating to personhood, how personhood may be connected not only to material culture, but animals, plants, vessels, that in death, how the transformation of memory and personhood involves new configurations of identity and perceptions of how the person operates socially, cosmologically and mythologically in death. None of that gets attention. And in terms of the relationship between burial, technology, material culture and space, there's nothing in there comparable with the spatial analysis and discussions of kinship and sociality in Duncan Sayers' 2020 book, Early Anglo-Saxon Cemeteries, Kinship, Community and Identity, which takes the debate forward looking at the contemporary inhumed dead, the unburnt dead, but doesn't deal with cremation. The focus in Hills and Lucy's book is very much on the urns and their contents, and that's very much following on from the work of Mads Raun, much of my work, and of course J.D. Richards' work looking at the symbolism of form and ornament of cremation urns. The limited discussion of spatial and material associations in the cremation process and the burial space is perhaps restricted only to comments already made by Jackie McKinley in her 1994 osteological analysis of Spong Hill, where she focuses on seeing spatial associations as burial groups. And Hills and Lucy very much replicate that idea, and reviews of the Spong Hill Volume 9 do the same, such as Bonnie Efros, who just talks about burial groups as family groups, as family plots. And in that regard, there's no discussion of the work of Heinrich Herker, Nick Stoodley, Duncan Sayer, and others who have tried to think about burial spaces more than simply about families, but as about multiple households who interact and negotiate those spaces and create their identities through the interactions between their social units and others at the graveside, in the burial of the dead, in articulating affinities and distinctions among the dead through where they are placed in the cemetery. None of those discussions are brought to the fore. And likewise, James Harland's more recent evaluations of the site doesn't really consider the sociality and communality of mortuary space at all. He just makes the axiomatic assumptions of a competitive discourse existing between families in the disposal of the dead, which is very much an idea borrowed from the work of Guy Housel, and an idea that has considerable merit in general terms in thinking about how early medieval mortuary practices would have been kinship focused concerns and competitive and to do with public display. But Harland only pursues this in relation to thinking about cremation's relationship to feasting practices, influencing how cremation was practiced and the locations chosen. These are places of communal gathering for burning the dead, burial of the dead, and a range of other possible activities, something I've argued in multiple articles of my own work. Now, before I proceed in advancing my own approach to this burial data and emphasising the importance of space, material culture and architectures in configuring a cosiness in death, an intimacy, a proximity and a sense of community, I have to take issue with James Harland's critique of my work on early Anglo-Saxon period cremation cemeteries as central space places, where he misrepresents my work by conducting a partial review, citing only one of the two key papers that I published on the idea of cremation cemeteries as central places, and in doing so Harland's work ignores the venue and context in which I'd been writing that one article, which was in a International Saxon Symposium proceedings where I was talking to a range of scholars from across Scandinavia and northern continental Europe as well as from England, and the term I'd used of considering these cremation cemeteries as comparable to many late Roman Iron Age and migration period cremation cemeteries in northern Germany and southern Scandinavia, and calling them Germanic in that context was obviously not to impose a racial category, but to speak of the affinities and the connections to that broader conversation about how we understand burial space. So he ignores the venue and context of my writing and then misrepresents my use of the phrase Germanic in that one chapter, where I never used it to impose a sense of a coherent shared racial identity, which he is implying I do. And also I made clear in my discussions of this cemetery that the cemetery would have operated as a formative discursive space where identities were being renegotiated and were not being transplanted wholesale from the continent. He then misrepresents my data for the significance of cremation cemeteries by claiming my only evidence for cremation cemeteries being of significance was that they lasted a long time, they were enduring, and they were conservative in character. Now that is actually an idea that Catherine Hills has promoted more than myself, but of course I agree. I did say that they are by definition continuing on from traditions and practices that have deep time continental roots and have no precedent in the British landscape of preceding centuries. In fact, my argument was much more nuanced, and I argue on the basis of the social and cosmological significance of cremation as a ritual technology itself, that this cremation was, and the places where cremation burials took place may have had significance. The cumulative ritual actions taking place in burying the dead over many decades and perhaps centuries in the same place afforded these places a distinctive association between the living and the dead. The dense clustering of urns and the fact that by burying the cremated dead you are facilitating a different kind of spatiality to inhumation was key, as was my analysis of the topographical locations of the cremation cemeteries I studied in eastern England in that article. And then also I looked at the broader archaeological distribution of finds from the environs of those sites and their wider landscape locations, drawing on the work of Kevin Leahy and Paul Everson and David Stocker and others who had looked at the Lincolnshire's cremation cemeteries and their relationship to the Roman landscape before and the Middle Anglo-Saxon landscape that succeeded it, and the rather tentative traces for the early Anglo-Saxon period. And he misrepresents my argument, Harland does, that cremation cemeteries are only a Germanic intrusion. I made the point that at the time of writing, 2.5 decades ago, the cremation cemeteries were seen as chronologically the earliest distinctive evidence of Germanic immigration or the influence of Germanic-speaking peoples in some form or other. And I used the Germanic term to avoid a bit more specific ethnic labels such as Anglo-Saxon, Angle, Saxon, Jute or anything else that we might speculate, because the baggage with those terms, which is an issue that Harland has been addressing in his own work. So I wasn't saying that Britain was entering the Germanic world only through the presence of these cemeteries, but at the time of writing these were seen as the most distinctive and indisputably continental influenced burial rites that we have from the island of Britain, and he doesn't dispute that himself, and nor does his mentor Guy Halsall, who has written in critical terms about seeing any of the artifactual and burial ritual evidence from early Anglo-Saxon period England as having a Germanic component, and yet still Halsall has conceded that cremation practices represent a new idea, a new introduction from the continent. Now, I have to add to that Harland misrepresents me quite gratuitously with a subheading called Remembering Germans and Ancestors. The term Germans I used in my doctoral thesis explicitly to critique the work of John Mitchell Kemble in the mid-19th century. So encapsulating that as my approach to the evidence is a gratuitous misrepresentation. And he puts in scare quotes the term ancestors, which I do use, and I justify it through cross-cultural analogy and discussion of the archaeological evidence. He takes issue with that, but presents no meaningful critique of that at all. But just highlights a vibe that he doesn't like about the use of the term. So he presents no alternative interpretation. He cites arguments by Housel that they were not published that were not published at the time of my writing, and were never developed in a coherent fashion using the data from the cremation cemeteries of eastern England. And he claims without support that cremation cemeteries are better interpreted as a particular group of people expressing a particular connection to another particular group across the North Sea in very specific circumstances. Now that's a very interesting argument, and one that I think I was actually making in the first place. This is not in opposition to what I argued. Indeed, it is one possible sub-reading of my own interpretation. I didn't take it far enough, but I think it's a point that these groups may be practicing a conservative mode of disposing of the dead to hark back as migrants to particular homeland locations. I certainly never said they were evoking some pan-Germanic identity. But so this promotes, the reason I didn't go so far is to do so would be to promote a specific ethnic label for cremation cemeteries that I was careful to avoid, since we don't know enough about these groups and exactly where they came from. And the work of Catherine Hills shows that many of the pots and the burial practices show a range of influences at Spong Hill and elsewhere, not to a specific existing community in one particular place, suggesting that we may be looking at a very heterogeneous population of not only native people but of different immigrant groups in and practicing and performing rituals at these cemeteries. So while I welcome Harlan's critique of my work, and I have no objection to having my work scrutinised, I think that he's promoting a line of reasoning that is actually more dangerously ethno-specific than I was willing to go down, and he's criticising me for saying things I never said and suggesting things I could have said that I actually did say. So it's a bit of an ironic situation. Harlan's book is intending to critique these ethnic interpretations, but he's willing to propose a more specific ethnic interpretation for cremation cemeteries in his writings than I ever did in mine. So to conclude this little segue into responding to Harlan's critiques, Harlan presents a partial and inadequate critique of cremation cemeteries as central places, which was a principal argument of trying to identify why these sites may have been so big and so enduring and important as burial places, where I argued that they were not simply burial places but places of assembly for a range of social, political and cultic practices. As a result, he falsely claims that my data-driven and contextual interpretations of cremation cemeteries are misleading, to use his words about my work, and too broad, whilst one, later agreeing with my interpretations and those whose work followed mine, and failing to engage in mortuary archaeological theories of memory, dismissed by him those approaches as unprovable, to talk about ancestors and to talk about memory. And this is absolutely pivotal to how we approach and understand the spatial, the material and the corporeal nature of these cremation cemeteries, I would contend. But how do we take constructive ways forward from this back and forth arguments about detail? Well, for me, I think this analytical category of cosiness can be a very useful way of re-engaging with multiple strands of our evidence from early Anglo-Saxon period cremation cemeteries. So whatever we think of the limitations of my earlier work and whatever we think of Harlan's critique, I think we can constructively build on this conversation to think of new ways to re-engage with these familiar lines of evidence. And I think Hills and Lucy spend very limited attention to this for Spong Hill, and there's been very little else in terms of spatial analysis and connecting spatial analysis to the architectural and the monumental dimensions of these spaces and the material evidence from individual burials. And now I can see there's many difficulties working with fragmentary osteological and artifactual data. And I accept that despite challenges of discerning, there are many challenges with discerning grave cuts and spatial associations in these cemeteries. And notwithstanding, there are many difficulties of discerning structures and monuments, given sites like Spong Hill have been heavily ploughed. So we end up focusing on the urns themselves. But I believe there's rich potential for further avenues for investigation of the coziness, the intimacies, the communality of post-cremation practices at Spong Hill, without simply dismissing any spatial associations or clusters as family plots. I think we can think beyond the family to think about the coziness of the burial practices. And that's what I want to do in the rest of this presentation, to get you to think about how we can, and future work can tackle the material, the spatial and the corporeal evidence together with the architectural and the monumental. Now, as I've developed my interpretation through a series of publications, I have argued that urns themselves, the choice to bury the dead after cremation by collecting up cremains, selections of the human remains with animal remains, burnt, pyre goods, and including them in a ceramic container for transportation, storage, and then later at some select moment burial, is a process of catalytic commemoration, by which I mean that the pots themselves aren't the things doing the remembering. They're not equivalent to gravestones. They are facilitating the commemoration of the dead by giving them a new form and space in which to reside. The act of collecting, storing, handling, transporting, displaying and burying the cremains was a process that facilitated the construction of social memories. And I think particularly important here is the idea that maybe the use of urns facilitated an understanding of the dead as stored, or perhaps, given Gareth Perry's work on the possibility many, if not all, of these urns, at least from other cremation cemeteries, could have been used in their life history for storing beer and butter, perhaps fermenting even, may have been a metaphor important for understanding the cremated dead in their urns from sites like Spong Hill and elsewhere. And as Ruth Nugent and myself have argued in a previous publication, these urns were decorated in a variety of distinctive ways, which may not be primarily or exclusively for the funerary context, but created an animated surface that could be interacted with. I have put forward the idea that some of the urns could actually be intended to look like ocular surfaces that stare out at those that interact with them. And there are rare traces of, but evocative ones, such as from Newark in Nottinghamshire, of lids that have birds upon them. So is there a sense that these were intended to be containers that protect, contain, but also perhaps provide an animated presence for the dead in the cemetery landscape? And the evidence we have from Spong Hill of lids, and I think other kinds of stopper, may also hint at this idea of the urn as more than simply a transportation device, but as a mechanism for mediating memories through storage and presence in the grave. And while it's a unique object, the Spong chairperson, perhaps part of a lid, and maybe unique or possibly one of many that were mainly rendered in wood and haven't survived, we have a distinctive figure who is standing guard or looking out from the pot that it was placed upon. And this makes us wonder whether the urn was not simply seen as a practical container and not simply coded with symbols, but actually was operating as a new body for the deceased, an animated presence for the dead in the grave. The idea of protection and marking graves has already been well recognised at sites like Spong Hill, but because of the disturbance of the graves, we don't know too much about exactly what this is to tell us. But what seems clear to me is that they're often misrepresented as the basis of cairns, whereas I think what we're looking at with these stone-packed graves are attempts to literally pack and store and protect the cremated dead. And while after 1500 years in the soil it looks like those stones are crushing the pots, because that's exactly what's happened, I think the original intention was to add protection and to afford the cremated dead with a consolidated place in relation to each other. And it's that spatial association which is absolutely intriguing, because while most of the urns at Spong cannot be associated with other pots, some of them can. In 90 cases there are pairs of cremation burials. In 70% of the case, according to Jackie McKinley's analysis, it was an adult with one immature individual, such as here with plots 1752 and 42 and 1751. So these pots, one containing an older mature adult female, one containing a mature adult male, whether they're man or wife, and or brother and sister, or a more distant relationship, these individuals are being afforded with a close intimacy in death. And we can see triplets doing this as well, such as urns 20, 32, 36 and 40, urns 30, 3019, 3020 and 3026, or indeed 2583, 2586 and 2563, 64 and 66, I beg your pardon. So we have these examples that show us the spatial proximities between the cremated dead. And of course there's a question that McKinley raises: are these being buried together, having been stored elsewhere and collected elsewhere, or are they having temporary covers over the graves, and are they going back, revisiting these sites and adding urns carefully to in proximity? We don't know. There are certainly what I would call snug burial groups, which I don't see why we should necessarily presume these are family groups. They could be wider households or other kinds of kin groups. But in this case, we have urns 2762 to 2778 in two pits that are conjoined, and the urns are not simply close to each other, they are absolutely balanced against each other, with a range of ages and genders associated with these urns, some of the urns containing multiple individuals. So in death there's an intimacy, a coziness, a snugness that you cannot see afforded to any other form of burial treatment. And there are many other burial groups where 3, 4, 5, 6 and more urns are placed in relation to each other. And while further analysis is required to tease out possible interpretations of these burial groups, this is a key and integral part of the burial practice that has been long neglected in other research. And beyond the fact that the cremation cemeteries may have operated as central places, this close proximity of the dead to each other I don't think can be explained in terms of competitive family practices, or in terms of simply family affinities. So here's a couple of examples to pull together the evidence. The urns are not reproduced to any specific scale, they're approximately sized, but this shows you a line of 5 burials. All of them have horse bone present in them, and then with pig in 2 and sheep and deer in a third, and adults, humans of different possible ages and genders. So we have a complex intermingling. It's not outrageous to suggest we're seeing in death a very intimate, snug or cosy story being told in death ritual. And likewise, these 4 vessels buried in close proximity, 1725, 6, 19 and 24, we can see different decorative designs, different shapes of pot, but they share in having, in 3 cases, horse, another burial has 2 dogs and a sheep evidenced, and individuals of different ages and associations. This urn is an animal accessory. In other words, there was no human bones in it, so it may be directly associated with the adult and horse in burial 1726, but the other 2 seem to relate to other individuals who are buried again right up next to the pots. And we also have other interactions of cremations with coziness in death, because cremations were found in the fill of, in other words added to, many of the small number of inhumation graves, of the 16 inhumation graves from the Spong Hill site, suggesting the inhumed dead could also receive further cremation deposits. And when you look at the entire cemetery, while I would stand by my arguments that these central places would have been multifunctional and the burial evidence is perhaps only part of a broader picture, I think we also have to consider that these are quite intimate household or social kinship spaces where the dead are buried in close proximity. And there are a number of densities, rows and arrangements which might have articulated those close spatial associations. In addition to that, in a paper published by myself with Katie Meyers Emery in 2018, I argued that we're missing a third disposal strategy for the dead in early Anglo-Saxon England. In addition to burial of the unburnt dead, inhumation, as well as burial of the cremated dead, as we call cremation burials, we may be seeing in the 4 and 5 post structures found across southern and central England, including eastern England, such as at Spong Hill, we have a possible way in which the dead were disposed of above ground in small mortuary houses, but also other features such as fences, post lines and other structures that could have been used to display and store the dead above ground. And briefly tackled in Hills and Lucy, we have a series of structures and arrangements of posts and arrangements of cremation burials that hint that there may have been some more elaborate above ground structures than we normally consider. So these may have been places where further cremations were buried, or temporary storage of cremation burial before they're later interred in association with these structures. So if we pull that together with the evidence that the cremation process was configuring a close intermingling of people and animal bodies, people and material culture bodies, there's a kind of almost an argument that could be made that there's a sense of distributed personhood, of coziness, of communality in the mortuary treatment of the early Anglo-Saxon period cremated dead that hasn't been considered before. And while I've only sketched out some of the avenues that we can consider this issue, I think I've done enough to show how we can move beyond simply saying, well, it's nothing to do with Germanic immigrants, or maybe it is. We can move beyond simply saying, oh, I object to Williams and his use of the term ancestors. We can start to see that fine-grained, intimate mortuary practices in which communities of perhaps families and households and other kin relations are honouring the dead at persistent places in the southeast British landscape. And these places would have been environments where other activities were going on, cultic, political, economic, social. They were places where the dead were thought to reside in close proximity with each other, almost communities for the dead. And I think it's that sense of place and technology that embeds and merges the dead with the place that provides the power for these cemeteries in communities under transformation following the breakup of the Roman province of Britannia and a series of dislocations, socio-economic, political, ideological. We may be seeing migrants and native peoples working together, collaborating together, interacting and integrating to form new kinds of communities in which an evocation to a hyper-conservative communal cemetery had a social agency, had a power. These were powerful places in the landscape, to take a term by Heinrich Hyer. These were places that would have been remembered, visited, and the seemingly humble urns may belie a broader, more complex story of these communities' development and change through the mid to late 5th century and into the early to mid 6th centuries. Now, I've already published extensively on this. I've highlighted some of the materials that Harland cites by highlighting them in green, but to point out that there's a broader literature I've already been developing looking at cremation in early Anglo-Saxon England. I welcome critiques of it, but it has to be in terms of what I've actually written rather than half-baked stereotypes of what they think I might have written, but they haven't done the work to read the sources of what I've actually written before making the critique. And so I would just point out that there's many constructive avenues forward for understanding early Anglo-Saxon cremation practices, drawing on the excellent work being done, taking on board the critiques presented, and thinking of new ways to interpret death and society in early Anglo-Saxon England. And I think that this concept of cosiness helps us to understand that material, social and technological intimacy and communality in the cremation of the dead. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Follow ArchaeoDeath on YouTube, TikTok, WordPress, and a host of other social media.